Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning. Good morning. Hi. Before we start, I've moderated panels before. Last time I moderated panels, I was told that I should tell people to silence their cell phones, but now I have to also say, please silence your watches. I'm Albert Hand, I'm the moderator. This is April 13, 2023, session number 17877 from 11 to 12:10. The title of the session is How Climate Change Affects National Security. There's some housekeeping I've got to do. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous people who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we handle the Q&A now. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card because we give priority to student questions. When you finish, raise your hand and hand it to the producer. Producer will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of our distinguished panelists here. The panelist who will lead us off is Alexander Verbeek. He's a Dutch environmentalist who lives in Canada now. He's well known for geopolitical risk issues and linkage to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. He's a World Fellow at Yale University. He has an online following of close to 500,000 people. Next is Elizabeth Shackelford. She's a senior fellow in U.S. policy with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She was a career diplomat with the U.S. Department of State until December 2017, when she resigned in protest of the Trump administration. And she was one of the first. And next is Michael English. Michael English is the Director of Peace, Conflict, and Security Program at the University of Colorado Boulder. Several of these panelists have books, and they should be available out on the desk. We will start off with each panelist will give opening remarks of 3 to 5 minutes, and then the panelists will respond to each other, and we'll get a conversation going. Before we go, I just want to note that in May of 2021, I was a little startled when I read that President Biden had said this. This is a quote. "When I was over in the tank in the Pentagon, when I was first elected vice president with President Obama, the military sat us down to let us know what the greatest threats facing America were, the greatest physical threats. And this is not a joke. You know what the Joint Chiefs told us the greatest threat facing America was? Global warming. I thought it was China. I thought it was Russia. But this is President Biden in May of 2021. The Joint Chief of Staff later kind of walked that remark back, but that certainly highlights the importance of this issue. And with that, I hand it over to Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just picking up on this thing, it just reminded me of the journey we've made on the climate security relationship, or how I personally like to use the word planetary security relationship, because this was 2021. And I got involved in this debate in 2008. I was then still a diplomat for Dutch Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Like Elizabeth, I left, but I had other reasons. I had no difficulty with my government in the Netherlands. I never had that in all the years with all the different governments we have. It's a different system. We have coalition governments. We never shift too much to one direction or the other. But I was then still a diplomat. I was posted in Vienna, beautiful Vienna, where I worked at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Simply put, the East-West debate that's still going on there between 56 countries. And then in 2008, they asked me to work to lead a committee for a full year of all 56 states on what the OSCE should do on their work on economy and environment. It's one of the three dimensions that they work on. So I led the discussions for a year and then wrote a report, the only report I ever wrote in my life that actually got my name, for the simple reason that the title of the report was so extremely long that nobody could remember it, even I don't know anymore. But one of the main recommendations there was that we should work as a security cooperation, basically covering the Northern Hemisphere, that we should work on the impact of climate change on security. And I think the reason that I found consensus is that, except for maybe the US and the UK, most countries didn't have a clue what I was talking about. The US was already working on it, the Pentagon was active on it, and some think tanks in Washington, and the UK worked with them. The rest just was nowhere. I can honestly say I went to my own Ministry of Defense in those days, and they saw that I spoke about sustainability and about using less energy, etc. And that was true all over Europe. That was 2008. Let's go fast forward. I have only a few minutes. Midway between then and now, we're in 2015, the year that the world agreed on the Paris Agreement in late 2015. It's also the time that I organized the first annual global conference on the impact of climate change on security. And I called it planetary security. Planetary because it's more than just the climate. We also talk about water, about biodiversity loss, about pollutions, all these changes that we have on our planet. And security is also more than just interstate security. Because if you're an individual, if you're poor and you live somewhere in a poor country, and the floods wash away the small plot of land that you have, and you and your family are hungry, you don't care whether you're hungry because of a war between countries or whether it was that your plot of land was washed away. The impact is the same. You're hungry, your children are dying. So the security is much wider from interstate all the way. It's a whole continuum to what we call human security. So then we already, that's now 7.5 years ago of this 15-year period, then already the whole world was talking about this. And nowadays, there's so much more acceptance, and that's maybe my last remark for now, because what has changed is that until about 5 years ago, I believe probably many people in this room were already convinced about climate change because of what you read in the newspapers, because you read the right newspapers and you don't watch Fox News. But that's because you're trained to read critically. But for most people, you know, the neighbors in the neighborhood where I live, they didn't get it. They confused climate and weather and all the other confusion. Partly is that created by the big oil companies and other people that have an interest there. But nowadays, you must be blind not to see it. I live in Ottawa now, where every year Ottawa is proud to have the biggest skating rink in the world. It's a canal that freezes, and it's enormous. For the first time now, since they opened it up in the 1970s, it hasn't frozen. So it's just one example. I'm sure you have many for yourselves as well. You see it around you. And that has changed the whole debate because we all now know that climate change is happening. And for now, I think we will talk much more about how that will impact security because there's a lot to say on it. But I went over my, was it 5 minutes? I'll stop there.
You right on the dot. Elizabeth?
All right, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of that direct line between climate change and national security because, as you heard from Alex, everyone here probably is well aware. You wouldn't be here if you didn't recognize climate change already and understand the challenge. But why does the Pentagon care? Why is the U.S. Department of Defense paying attention? Well, what are the impacts of climate change? You have things like rising temperatures. Rising temperatures are changing the landscape for food production. Food production affects food insecurity. And you're looking at places right now like the Horn of Africa, which is entering its 5th missed rainy season. That creates, as Alex said, people don't care why they're starving, but if they're starving, they're going to move, they're going to change, they might get into conflict. That is something that will affect our national security interests in that region. And it's not just that region, it's all around the world. Food insecurity is one of the biggest issues that we're facing because the global population is expected to rise, but with the increasing impacts of climate change, we're expecting crop yields to reduce. More parts of the earth are going to become uninhabitable. What does this mean? This means that right now I think we've got about 30 million people annually that are kind of being pushed from their homes and migrating away because they can't sustain a living or because there's conflict over these increasingly fewer resources. We have primarily arable land and water. And so you're having more people, less things that sustain human life, and that creates more conflict. So that conflict side of the issue and that migration side of the issue creates instabilities that impact our national security interests. What are our national security interests in some of these places? It's the kind of efficiency and effectiveness of the global economy that our prosperity depends largely on. And it's impacting the security of kind of our allies and our partners around the world that we work with both economically and on the security front. So that's kind of, you're talking about that limitation of the resources that is really getting to the heart of our national security interests around the world. Then you get to things like natural disasters, which we're getting more of and they're getting more frequent. Natural disasters and the weather risks that come from that are affecting, are also furthering these migration flows and the impact on natural resources that people need to survive. They're also impacting critical infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, for example. And that impacts us economically because it costs a lot of money to recover from something like, let's say, the power grid meltdown that happened in Texas a couple of years ago. But it also, so it costs us economically, but it also costs our security because when you have these natural disasters happening in other parts of the world, it fuels that increased instability and conflict that happens in places that impact the global economy, that impact our partners, and impact our kind of global prosperity. If you look at these greater stresses in the natural world that are coming from reduced resources and from humans trying to push into areas that we haven't been, that opens the door for global pandemics. I don't think I need to convince anyone here that having global pandemics can seriously impact our national security because we've all seen that firsthand with COVID, with the COVID crisis. And then, kind of another, there are two more parts that I think are kind of separate ways that it impacts our national security. One is our continued reliance on fossil fuels is limiting our foreign policy options. This is a different type of impact on our national security, but our traditional reliance on our global economy functioning based on oil means that we have to have pretty bad bedfellows, like Saudi Arabia, for example. And so our opportunities to kind of change our foreign policy decisions are really limited by the need that we have to have partnerships with the folks who, kind of corner the market on things like that. Our dependence on fossil fuels gives countries like Russia much more power on the global scale than they would have otherwise. And so that's even more need to address climate change by expanding our access to renewables and our ability to develop those at home as well. And then kind of one last very specific impact on global national security is that climate change is opening up the Arctic. And the Arctic is a space that is going to be a massive kind of great power competition nexus because of Russia and China and the United States battling over resources, over access, and over transport as those, kind of that glacial area melts, and that suddenly becomes another area of competition. So those are a few examples of how it impacts national security. Climate change and environmental degradation are also costing and risking our military directly. So those are the big national security pictures, but let's talk about the tool that we have that needs to help us both deter threats and address and respond to threats in the global sphere. And right now, the most urgent threat to our military infrastructure is rising sea levels and big storms. So that affects our military readiness. That affects the ability of our military to put more resources to other things. Is that 3 or is that 5? Where am I? I've spoken
That's
over.
about 5.
That's about 5. Okay, the final thing I will say is that the U.S. national security is harmed by climate change, but it is also a big cause of it. The U.S. Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum and the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, so we are harmed by it and a problem ourselves.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, again, in terms of opening remarks, I think Alexander and Elizabeth have covered the main points. And, to pick up some on Elizabeth's last point, New York Times writes how many articles this past month about Bitcoin? The Department of Defense uses the equivalent of Sweden's fuel to power the 1,000+ bases that we apparently have all over the world. When you talk about this issue, this is an issue of empire. We are dealing with the costs of the United States trying to have a global empire for 70 years. Right? I mean, again, our hypocrisy contributes to this issue. And so if you're going to talk about national security, to Alexander's point about how we've tried to flip the security conversation, you have to say, what does it mean to securitize something? What does it mean to put something under the purview of national security? Because when you do that, you then start to excuse all of these bad behaviors that are about securing and maintaining sources of fuel to run a global military empire, right? And again, I'm not trying to say here, good or bad, you all are adults, you can make up your mind about how you feel about the issue of empire, but that's what you're dealing with, right? You are dealing with an organization that's purpose is to make war, and war is a fossil fuel enterprise. There is no other way to kill people without fossil fuels, right? And you may need to kill people, you may not need to kill people, but to kill people, you need diesel. And this is where we're at. And, kind of back to the point Albert started us off with, the Pentagon has known about climate change since 1950, when they started studying nuclear weapons and the effects of nuclear fallout and discovered carbon was hanging out up in the atmosphere. When I was in DC 11, 12 years ago, I would attend panels at the Center for American Policy where people from the Pentagon would come talk about the Pentagon's transition to renewables and the Pentagon's need to get off of fossil fuels to do what it needs to do. The Pentagon has long been aware of this, right? But politically, they feel they can't say anything because to open their mouths is to anger, if we can put it that way, half the country at this point. But again, if we think that having a strong military is important, if we think that our partnerships with alliances across the world is important in a military capacity, we have to appreciate that that capacity is based on detrimental effects to the climate. There's no other way to do this and to have those outposts that we have that we think are necessary for defending a particular global order. We're not even talking about what happens if things escalate in Ukraine and Russia, right? Climate disaster, let alone a nuclear disaster, if things continue to go the way they are. So, you know, this conversation is vital, and it's vital that people think about what does it mean to do national security? Because there are consequences, and those consequences get ignored when we find ways to talk about climate change in all these other capacities, but, you know, back to the point Elizabeth closed with, not acknowledge that our military is the #1 consumer of fossil fuels in the world.
All right, I just want to remind people that if you want a question, raise your hand and you'll get a card. Do you guys want to talk about what each other has talked about, or? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, coming back to your last remark, it's also interesting that if you look at a place like Afghanistan, where you have posts far out from Kabul, or where you used to have posts far out of Kabul, where American troops were, they were running everything on diesel. So you needed an enormous amount of troops to transport diesel all the way to some outpost in Afghanistan. You needed to guard it, you needed a lot of troops for that. There was a huge risk of explosive devices that would blow it up. Just give them some solar panels. I mean, it's Afghanistan, it's hot, right? I mean, all the sun is coming down. You have electricity there. But a culture and a political system where you allow company money to define your politics creates a system where everything is oriented towards those sponsors of those politics. And it is the old guard, those earning their money in the oil, that is so extremely negatively influential on about everything I see happening in the United States of America. And I regret that very much. It's the country that liberated us in Europe. I see all these changes happening, and it's a sad thing. I mean, everything I hear on this table pleads for a very different approach to energy and to security and to climate change, and don't see climate change as a kind of threat per se. The climate change gives an opportunity to completely differently organize your society. You can create a society that is cleaner, that is healthier, where you're less dependent on other countries, and actually a society that would be more fair and equal. And that is something that this country needs. Thanks.
I would just add in that I have great faith in the military-industrial complex's ability to find other ways to kill people if they had to. They're very resourceful if they must be. Now, we don't yet know how to do that because we've been so reliant on diesel, so I absolutely take your point, Michael. But I do think at the end of the day, it is hard to get around the fact that most of America's problems, including America's problem with addressing climate change, comes back to money and politics. And that unfortunately drives so much of what we do. If I could pick one singular thing to change on Earth, it would be the Citizens United ruling in the Supreme Court. And I think it would make huge difference across the board.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Albert, I'm going to be good and let you ask questions because we academics can talk too much.
No, go ahead. The questions are not coming in
No.
very quickly. Okay.
I feel like we've got lots of questions coming now.
Question. Why can't hydrogen be used to reduce the use of diesel? The military's use of diesel.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Take it.
Somebody have an answer?
I mean, it's because we haven't tried hard enough yet. I am no scientist, so I can't get into the ins and outs and details of how that would work, but I do believe that 100 years of subsidizing fossil fuels in this country has meant that we have doubled down on the use of fossil fuels. And there's an innate tension in trying to run politics in a democracy that has such a heavy influence of money and pressing industry to change. I think ultimately, and you're seeing this already, a lot of industries are getting on the kind of renewables bandwagon, and hydrogen is certainly something that's being more researched now. But until we stop putting our thumb on the scale of fossil fuels, which we've been doing for 100 years, that won't change. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is a good, big first start, although of course our European friends are very happy about that.
We are. Speaking for all of Europe.
I would just add on that too, and this goes back to a point that we all need to be thinking about as well, is, you know, it takes natural resources to build batteries, to build energy storage devices, to transition to solar, to transition to wind. You have to get those minerals from somewhere, and they are not in the good old US of A. Congo's the huge one. Congo's suffered enough, and the race to get the new minerals to build batteries is going to intensify pressures in those countries, especially like Congo, as we benefit, right? So again, you know, it's important, like everybody on this panel will tell you, we need a renewable future. There are consequences to a renewable future that we are not talking about, and they will come at the cost of people that have already suffered the future we've built.
Renewables are part of the answer, but just less, and using less, and having fewer bases and all that. It's essential. We won't get there. You can't just do a one in, one out substitute.
Here's a question. Is the U.S. military actively opposed to non-petroleum power? Do they lobby against it?
Can I say a few things here? Yeah. I have never, ever seen any indication of the US military, the Pentagon, lobbying in any way against this. And I have actually seen over the years that a lot of good thinking is taking place in the Pentagon. They know that they are, of course, part of, you're immediately drawn into this political debate. But purely looking from a military perspective, I see a lot of interesting thoughts coming out there. They see the risk. They were among the first in the world to see the risk. They look at their own use. They are aware of how much they are using, and the examples you gave being such a massive producer of fossil fuels. For some part, you can't change that yet. Let's say if you fly a fighter jet, you can't do that on solar panels, right? But you can look at making less use of afterburners, etc. So especially in the US Navy, that they've been actually outspoken on the debate on warning people about what's happening on a place like harbors like Norfolk, etc. That they're warning about the limited capacity they have to actually solve the problem. They can raise the harbor, but the 40 kilometers, 25 miles that you need to go through very low land to get to the harbor, that's not their responsibility. If that's water, you can still have a harbor that's above water, but all your Navy personnel is just wondering how they can get to their own harbor. They're giving these kind of warnings. I don't see indications, but I would love to be corrected by Elizabeth that's followed this much better if there are different stories, but I haven't seen them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And the Department of Defense has been at the forefront of doing research and thinking on this. The challenge is that the Department of Defense is also at the forefront of a whole lot of other things. And so there is the very, very, very important, I mean, this is looking from a Pentagon perspective of climate change, but then there's, oh my word, China. And so the Department of Defense is stretched in a lot of different ways. And it's also hemmed in by what Congress wants it to focus on. So let's look at examples like the Pentagon budget. The Pentagon budget of last year, the Department of Defense comes in with the executive branch and says we need, I'm going to blank on my numbers here, but it was $800 billion something, maybe 825 billion, I think. That sounds right? And then Congress comes back and like, we're giving you almost 900 billion. And they're like, why? And they're like, because we're going to make you keep those ships and planes that you didn't actually want. So they do get hemmed in by those decisions. And Congress is making its decisions largely based on special interests. So they tack on, well, we don't want you to close down this line of production or finish with these, retire these ships or retire these planes. We want to make sure you sell enough of these because my constituency is focused on, it has a lot of people with jobs related to that. So, I think if you gave the Pentagon free rein, they would probably be doing a lot more. But it does come back to this fact of the Pentagon is already doing too much out there. We have too many bases, we have too many troops around the world, and I couldn't tell you, I'll be totally honest, what the right budget is and what the right number is. But what I do know is that currently, a lot of inertia is driving what we do in defense. It's really hard for Congress to say, we really need to pivot to the focus on China right now, so we're going to rein in some of what we're doing in the Middle East. Because then somebody's going to say, if I vote on that, and then there's a terrorist attack, then that's going to be on me. And so instead of shifting our focus to other greater problems, they're adding more. So this is why our Pentagon budget has been expanding tremendously. So I think it's an inability to prioritize at the end of the day. So while you've got a lot of people in the DoD that are really focused on how do we do this better, how do we switch over more things to renewables, then you have 90% of the rest of it who's also still marching down the path of doing what we're already doing, and we don't have the technology to do all of that in a way that doesn't impact climate change yet. So I think it's just kind of a more and adding on. But I do think more answers in the US government are coming out of the Department of Defense than in other places. We just can't get them to rein in at the same time, too.
Here's a question. If we in the United States did everything we could to rein in climate change, does that really matter if China and India don't rein in fossil fuels?
Of course it matters, right? Like I'll call it hysteria over China in the United States right now is intense. Is China an issue? Of course, right? There's no way that US-China relations are not important. But as I've heard from countless of my students and peers from the developing world, why the double standard? You've taken advantage of us for a century or more. And now that we're on the upswing, and again, China doesn't seem to have a problem signing agreements when they actually sign them and staying in them. There's another country I know, this one perhaps, doesn't like to be held to any agreements, right? What did we do with the Kyoto protocols? Did we sign them? Oh, no, we wanted to put in some reservations there that we wouldn't talk about all the different things the US didn't want to have measured under Kyoto, right? So again, should we be encouraging China and India, Brazil, the rest of the world to hold to international agreements, for everybody to meet the standards set in Paris? Of course. But, there's this continual thought that it's the rest of the world that's not doing enough on climate change when we are still the #1 polluter in the world with no interest in changing, right? Like, I'd love to pretend that this is a China problem. But until we start getting off the top spending list of carbon emissions, it's going to be really hard for the rest of the world to take us seriously.
Do the other panelists agree with?
I mean, I would chime in that I actually do think that we are doing a fair
Are we
amount.
the #1 polluter in the world?
China is taking us over. We are historically, we have emitted more than any other country, but our pace is slowing compared to China at this stage. Now, that doesn't change the fact, and I do agree with Michael, I mean, When we're telling other countries that you've got to rein in, your use of carbons, and they're like, you had industrial growth based on that, and we are still catching up. So I understand that, but that's one of the places where, listen, if you're Gabon, then you might say, well, if the US and China aren't going to do this, then what does it matter? And I mean, like, if I were in Gabon and I was like, nobody's doing anything, why am I sorting my recycling? I mean, yes, if you're a tiny country, that argument does stand. We need bigger countries to take the lead. But yes, the US, not only will it make a big difference the more we're able to do, but it also has a big impact on what the rest of the world does. We're looking at a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma between the United States and China. We are competitive. And with the absolute best case scenario for addressing climate change effectively, if the United States and China and all the other countries in the world cooperate on it. The next best case is if the United States and China both separately, as they are recognizing today, recognize that we can't stay on the path we're on because it's unsustainable. China recognizes that they need to also invest in renewables because they've got a lot of people to feed, and natural disasters affect them too. They had internal flooding a couple of years ago that was really disastrous. Like, they know they've got to address this also. But that prisoner's dilemma, which is, well, if the US is going to keep just getting rich and charging ahead on fossil fuels, then we need to also to stay ahead. So nobody wants to do it really first. But I do think that, especially under this administration, we've seen changes. They're not fast enough. And I do think that we need to stop with the finger wagging at other places and lead by example instead. But I do think, yes, if the US takes the lead and just focuses on what we can do, it's not as good as going toe-to-toe with China working on it together, but it's certainly better than the alternative.
No, I think so too. If America wants to be the leader of the world, you have to lead on all fronts. And that includes climate change.
Yep.
If you look at China, China is the biggest investor in the world in renewable energy. Is that only because they're far ahead of the crowd on climate change? No, because they are the biggest investor in energy, period, and they take anything that they can use. So there may have been a climate thought behind there, but they're also a massive investor in fossil fuels. So they are at the moment the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. But it depends a bit on how you define the biggest, and I think that's where you come from. If you look per head of the population, the Americans use far more fossil fuels than the Chinese do. If you look at the historical emissions, the American emissions are far more than China ever did. And all that CO2 that you produced is still out there and is still working as a greenhouse gas. So if you want to have a kind of guilty verdict, it is the US. But that is not the kind of debate we should have. We should not talk about who is guilty on what. We have one very small planet, which is, as far as I'm informed, the most beautiful one in the whole universe. And on that little planet, where you can just fly in 24 hours to wherever you want to go in the world, but if you keep flying, you're back at where you started. I mean, we're that small nowadays. We're no longer in the times of Columbus or something, that it took you months and months to get somewhere. It's a very small planet. It's crowded. We're still growing in population, but more importantly, we're growing in our consumption patterns because more people are lifted out of poverty and reaching the middle class, and I'm happy for each and every person that is lifted out of poverty, like 600 million in China. I'm so happy for these people that they now have a house and a color television, and that's really because they're moving up to the level that all of us already are. But there is not enough room for all of that unless we really change what we are doing. And then the key question that brought us here, should the US wait with, just sitting on their hands, not doing anything until China moves? No, hell no, we shouldn't. You should be ahead of it. And it's not only out of a moral perspective that you should do it, but it's also because of innovation and because of being a leader and actually taking care of your own people, because you also make a country and a planet that is more beautiful and that is more healthy to live and where you have less air pollution. And actually, because you need to take an holistic approach and not only look at the military or only look at one country, you need to take a holistic approach at everything. It means that you will also take care of your biodiversity, you will take care of pollution, you will take care of the huge differences between rich and poor within your country and between countries, between the North-South debate. Because this planet is so small, we have to do it all together. And that's it. You shouldn't wait for anybody else, because that's a typical kind of tragedy of the commons approach that never ever got us anywhere. So you have to lead, and there's a lot of advantages in it to be a leader. Take a small country like Denmark that decided in the 1970s that they would change their energy production. That wasn't for being green, that was because Denmark wanted to be independent of the kind of oil boycotts they had experienced in the early 70s from Saudi Arabia and a few others. At that moment, they found out, and it took them a few years, that the best option was actually to focus on wind energy. Now they're a world leader on wind energy. They're far ahead of anybody else, and you need their knowledge and technology. It's been a good investment for the country. They earn a lot of money on it, and it is cleaner, and it is just a better and green country. Go there some days. It's beautiful. You know, everybody's on a bicycle and everything. That is the kind of happy community country that you would like to have, because they take these kind of decisions. And you have to be brave to be there. And you need, it's not a question of technology. It is all about governance and political will. If you have the political will, then you can actually get there. And that's what the world needs, and America should lead.
Stop funding Ukraine.
It's a different topic.
Fund climate change.
Okay.
Where the money is.
It's actually
I'm going to compress a couple of questions here into to one question. But I just noticed this morning that Germany was announced today, at least in the press, closing its last nuclear reactor. And the question is, if you're really concerned about climate change, and everybody's concerned about climate change, why not nuclear? Isn't that the solution?
We want to talk hot button issues.
I know.
I like it.
More people yelling at us.
No. I mean, that's a legitimate.
No, it's a great question, and
Yeah.
and there, you know, you're going to find people on both sides of this, right? That certainly the anti-nuclear argument has compelling evidence that any nuclear fuel you produce, you are passing on to generations upon generations upon generations. So whatever disasters befall us, be they the 3 Mile Island kind, the Chernobyl kind, or dare I say, nuclear fallout from whatever may transpire, that's thousands of years of dealing with nuclear issues. Have we proven ourselves capable of managing this effectively? You know, there are questions. You know, none of you in here are going to be, you all know the history of Rocky Flats and what plutonium production dilemmas cause down the road. So certainly the anti-nuclear argument is a strong one, but the pro-nuclear argument also has a real challenge for us, which is to say, if you want to get off fossil fuel tomorrow, there's nuclear. We know how to do it. We know how to do it relatively safely. Yes, storage is a problem, but if you want an energy source, we can make it. And again, I can't tell you what the better answer is there. I can tell you that both of them come with consequences. But you know, this is the challenge for us. If we can't do solar and other renewables at scale fast enough to keep us under the threshold of global warming that has been set in our agreements, 2030, I thought 2030 was so far away. Oh, we are almost there, and that number keeps getting reduced every year as to our 1.5 threshold. But you know, this is the argument that we need to think about. Is nuclear feasible? And again, I don't know if I have an opinion on that, other than to say this is what I have studied, this is what I've heard, this is what experts tell us.
I think it's very interesting that the academic is giving the diplomatic answer here. I'm going to riskily wade into this, but the question for me with nuclear is very scary because the disasters are very big and very scary. But if you actually calculate, and this is one of the big challenges with climate change over a long period of time, is that it's been a very, very bad burn. It's been a pretty slow burn, and it's been harder to see until very recently how much damage it's causing. And if you calculate the deaths and the sicknesses and the cancers from the emissions of fossil fuels, every single year they are more than we have ever had from any nuclear disaster. Every year, people by the hundreds of thousands are dying from exposure to the toxins, to the pollution, to the air quality, to poisoned water. I mean, all of this is tremendous. So for me, I don't have a specific answer, but to say that I think that we absolutely need to keep nuclear in the mix in terms of we need to do more research on how to do it safely. But Europe, for a very long time, has had very good experiences with nuclear. France has used it for a long time, and we can certainly do it better. We need to be very safe about it. The emergency situations where we've seen have been where there has been serious neglect. We know that, we understand it, but it's one of those things where you shouldn't wipe it off the table as an option because it sounds scary, because frankly, fossil fuel emissions are very, very scary and impact far, far more people every day than we recognize. So what I think we have not yet done is appropriately compare the costs of fossil fuel use in order to have a real debate over the costs and benefits of different options, nuclear being one of them. I think that the bad rap that nuclear gets because of the scare factor, and I admit it's scary, but I think that we have, in Europe in particular, they've pushed something off the table that is a very real option, and we're dealing with an existential threat, so we need to really explore all of the better options.
Yeah, frankly, I think there's, I would prefer solar and wind above nuclear, and I guess it would be hard to find anybody in this room that doesn't agree. But the point is, the biggest threat that we have to our life on this planet at this moment is the rising levels of greenhouse gases. They are not produced by nuclear. We have to stop that as soon as possible, and like practically any scientist in the world will say that. So once we focus on that, I fear that we don't have the luxury to be very picky on what is left. And yeah, probably nuclear will be at the lowest on my list, also because I'm not trained enough to make a fair decision on how safe it actually is. But the numbers that you just mentioned, I'm in full agreement there. So I think don't prioritize phasing out nuclear fuel when we have another priority that is much more important. And frankly, I believe that Germany took the wrong decision because they were increasing the use of fossil fuel to get rid of nuclear in a very quick and rather emotional response to what happened in Fukushima. But there are no tsunamis in Germany the last time I checked. Thanks.
In the future.
What do you expect the anticipated increase in use of electric cars will have on climate change?
Yeah, great, all for it. I think quite a few of you will have been here, I guess now about 4 years ago, when the keynote presentation was about electric vehicles. I think it was one of the best keynote presentations I've seen in many years, which predicted by around the year 2023, we would see an enormous uptick on the use of electric vehicles. And actually, at the moment, we see a tremendous uptick in the use of electric vehicles. That's a good thing. But there's much more that you can do apart from just changing the cars. One thing you can do, and I'm speaking here as a Dutchman, a country where we have more bicycles than people, is make less use of cars. We're now developing whole new areas of towns where, new built areas in towns where there's basically no cars. Because a car in the Netherlands is not used, and probably the same in America, well, maybe a bit less here, but in Netherlands, a car is, on average, not used for 96% of the time. So why not turn that around? Make cars that are used 96% of the time, just by doing that together. A lot of my friends, I live on an island where I need a car because I can't be part of that system, but a lot of my friends in the Netherlands have good incomes, but they don't have a car. They're just part of a car sharing thing. There's like everywhere there are cars nearby, and you just, just on your app, you look where they are, you take one of those cars and they use those. It costs them less money. It creates a lot less pollution. It's also a lot less hassle because you don't have to pay for all your insurance. You have to have the car checked and get petrol and all kinds of other things that you need to do. And it's a beautiful example, especially combined with perfect public transport and cities that are designed for a cyclist. We have cycling lanes everywhere. We have two ways of traffic. You have one for the cars and one for the bicycles. We have our own traffic lights, etc. It's perfectly safe. Nobody wears a helmet apart from American tourists. And it's a way to do it. I live now in North America since a few years in Ottawa, and there I just see how the city is designed. And as I said, we have to look much further than just fossil fuels. It's about how you organize a society. If you look at a city like Ottawa, Boulder's maybe not the best example, but take an average North American city. There you have like a central business district, and there's only business and a Starbucks, right? And then somewhere else, the people live. But if you need whatever, some toothpaste that you forgot to buy, you have to get in your car to go out and buy that one tube of toothpaste because you can't walk there. The way we organize cities in Europe, and there's a historical story there as well, we have this 15-minute city. I've all my life living in Europe, I've done my shopping on my bicycle or walking. And that's not by some kind of principles, just because that's the way things are organized. Now in Canada, I have to get in my car, even if I just need to buy something small, because shops are there, people live here, and offices are there. And maybe now that so many offices are empty after the pandemic and people are reluctant to go back to the offices, why not grab that opportunity and change those offices and those inner centers of cities in a completely new way, where you combine living and entertainment and shopping and working into one area, where at the end of the day, the people are more happy because they got everything nearby, and you use much less fossil fuels. So as I said, it's much wider than just looking only at the military and only at fossil fuels. It is a complete change of the way you organize your societies and how we are dealing with each other together on this small, beautiful planet.
Can you talk about the destructive impact of new resources opening up in the Arctic and Antarctica?
All right, I guess I'm going to take this one. I don't think that we fully understand yet what the impact of that is all going to be, but it is, it's nerve-wracking because it's opening up new areas for competition, and we don't kind of have the global agreements around how to handle that we've got over other parts of the world. We've got things like laws of the sea, but we don't have a way to understand kind of where the territories of, Russia's claiming an awful lot of the Arctic. China's claiming that it is an Arctic nation, and because it's like we're big enough so we should get a piece of that pie. We've got, this is happening more and more, and those debates are getting heated in diplomatic circles. In terms of kind of like the scientific, the physical impact of it, it's going to be destructive to areas that are fairly pristine, and we're going to see that because you have fossil fuels in some of these places that can be extracted. I think we don't fully understand what all of the resources are in the Arctic and Antarctic that can be exploited, and there's certainly going to be a very big interest in doing that as different, as we're having a greater need for both, fossil fuels as we're still using them and other resources. But I think my biggest concern with what's going to happen, particularly with the Arctic, is that it's going to open up areas for conflict. And that conflict is going to push countries like Russia, like China, like the United States, who does this more than anyone else, to go out and try and put outposts, to try and kind of stick our flag in the melting ice wherever it is, to start opening up trade routes going through there. I mean, you cannot underestimate how a trade route going through a place that used to be entirely ice is going to impact any natural habitat that you have going on there. It's going to make places that have had no exposure to, kind of like the human industry, having waste and pollution coming through those waters. So I think it's going to have a really harmful effect on the natural world up there as well. And that's one of the reasons that you don't hear a lot about it. I want to say it was a few months ago, there was an agreement, kind of a tentative agreement and debate over how we start to deal with the Arctic. So it's something that we're starting to see, kind of more diplomatic meetings about, discussions about, but it's the change up there is happening faster than our ability to grasp how best to handle it, and that's where it really opens up the potential for, for not just impact but conflict. Any other thoughts on the Arctic?
I think you nailed it.
Okay. There's nobody here who knows more than to tell me that I was totally wrong.
Here's a question. What risks are nations confronted with by climate-induced migration, both into and out of countries?
Well, that's a great question. There's two very different experiences. I used to live in Malta, which is in the middle of the Mediterranean and is a crossing route into Europe for migrants coming out of the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, who are, in some cases, dealing with the effects of war, other cases dealing with economic decline. All of our studies are showing us the climate is present as part of their migration, even if it is not the causal factor for them leaving. And the intensity with which Europe is dealing with a migration crisis, we talk about it a lot here. It's serious here. I'm not downplaying that. It's a different beast in Europe. And being in Malta, right, getting the opportunity to work with migrants, to ask them questions about why they were coming over here and what the European asylum process was like for them, was heartbreaking because there was no process. There was detention and there was deportation. Very few were able to file asylum claims because the asylum system is not set up for climate migration. So we are entering an era that we do not have policies in place to deal with the thing that is going to be driving the most people to leave their homes. And again, you can think about this on the US, on the Texas-Mexico border, right? All of the administrations, cross-party, yes, you can blame them for things they do, but at the same time, you can say US government does not have policies in place to deal with this crisis, and this is going to get worse because we know it's going to get hotter and more people are going to keep moving. It's a real thing, and the fact that we're not having substantive conversations about what it would mean to legally recognize climate migrants and to provide them with an asylum process is not helping. But it's real, and people are going to be moving, and wherever you go, governments are going to be facing this challenge. And from a conflict perspective, the real tragedy here is that it's not that people don't want to help migrants, right? I think there's this assumption that we're all xenophobic and racist and, there are some folks like that. But in my experience, communities that work with migrants tend to be very welcoming. And what turns them into people that want to turn migrants away is the fact that they don't have policies and resources to deal with new people coming in addition to all of the problems they themselves are facing. And there's no support for that. And Malta was an interesting case of this because in the EU, you are processed where you land. So if you're a migrant and you land in Malta, Malta being the size of Boulder, and having countries, you stay in Malta. You are processed in Malta. Well, what happens when an island of 600,000 people is now faced with routinely 15 to 60,000 people a year landing in their area, trying on their way to make it to continental Europe. And Europe says, no, you deal with it. We've got to work with Italy and Greece on their island issues. Right, that's really, really stressful. And so we do need to appreciate that, not dealing with this issue is going to generate conflicts in communities that are on the front lines of it, and that it's not slowing down.
Maybe to add to that, there's a lot of attention for migrants either coming into North America or Europe, and it's a very serious issue. But we often tend to forget about all kinds of other migrations that are taking place. Actually, most migrations take place within countries and have horrible consequences. And again, if you look at the individual level, that's terrible. Take a country like Bangladesh. Literally thousands of people every day, and this number is checked and researched, thousands of people every day take the decision in Bangladesh to leave from the coastline because it's getting too saline, is that the word in English, too salty, that they can still grow their rice. So the family packs whatever they have and they move to the capital of Dhaka or to other cities. These are massive problems that these poor countries are dealing with, and it never makes it to the front pages. So migration is a huge issue. Don't see it purely as poor people that want to go to the rich countries, because in the vast majority of cases, and I dare to say 99%, and if it's not more, the people stay within their region. And if you then think about close to Europe, Northern Africa, the Potsdam Institute in Berlin that focuses on the impact of climate change says that by 2050, and that's not too far away, vast areas in Northern Africa will be several months a year too hot for normal people to live, people like us. We will die if we would be there. So these people can't live there, simply can't live there. It's not their fault. They never burned any fossil fuels, we did. So where do these people go? Well, unlike what you would think of, that they immediately get the boat to Europe, what they actually do is they move up a little bit to the nearest area where living is possible. That's normally what migrants do. It's only a small part that is moving to the Western world. And yeah, that's, as you very well described, a big set of problems to look up at as well. But we have to look also at the bigger picture of where most people are going. And because of our use of fossil fuels, the poorest people in the poorest countries have no future.
Okay, here's a question for all of you, or each of you. If you had to choose only 3 policy solutions to address some of these issues at the nexus of climate change and national security, what policy solutions would you choose?
Get 2 of them immediately.
I got 2 of them immediately too. So together we got 4.
What are yours?
Okay, I would say, first of all, mitigation. You have to, if you have a problem, if you have a leakage in the house, you start by stopping the leakage and then you deal with the damage, right? So although we focus a lot on adaptation, which is very important, we have to deal with the cause of the problem of climate change. And that means, first and foremost, getting rid of fossil fuels as soon as possible, and together with other measures, things like agriculture, but also being more efficient in what we do. The other thing I think is that, and I've noticed that here several times already, we're in all of this together. It means there should be far more cooperation between the rich north and the poor south. And yes, we will pay some money for that, but we can solve climate change with only just a few percentage of our national income. It is not so much money that we're actually talking about. We have the knowledge how to do it. We have the technology. The only thing that is lacking is political will. So what we need is more cooperation, more solidarity, and a more global, holistic view in tackling our policies. And For those people that believe in a small government, I have bad news, because you actually need governance to solve problems. So it's okay, if you want to know about my political direction, that's where I will go. Giving away secrets here.
Right, so I'm going to be much more specific to like U.S. policy. The first, which I've already said, which is find a way to change money in politics, to whether it's through transparency, whether it's through limitations. I mean, the easiest is to get rid of Citizens United so that corporations can't donate untold amounts of money. But yeah, I think that is the number one issue.
Hear, hear.
The second issue is to absolutely finally end subsidies for fossil fuels. A big challenge is that, again, for 100 years, the U.S. government has been artificially lowering the price of fossil fuels. That is why the United States has been built and developed as a car-focused nation. There was a reason for that back in the day. I don't particularly agree with it, but I think today there is just no justification for subsidizing the cost of fossil fuels. Now, what that would do is that would change, kind of flip the script on this argument that, yeah, renewables are nice, but they're too expensive. The truth is, we have been making fossil fuel use less expensive over time. And then the last policy that it would be hard for the U.S. to do this on their own, but I think it would be really important to do this with kind of like our family and friends of the nations, is to price in the cost of carbon use into all of the cheap goods that we get in the United States. You think it's really cheap to buy stuff that has been shipped from 6 different countries to each other to finally be compiled into one product that you buy off of Amazon that gets shipped over from China. But that is because we are not costing in the cost of that shipment back and forth to our environment. So we have to, carbon, kind of carbon tax is kind of considered passé. Nobody likes the idea of carbon tax anymore. But at the end of the day, it's not a tax, it's a cost. It is a cost to our environment, and we have to find a way to do that, to stop putting the thumb on the scale of fossil fuel use.
I agree with everything they both said, and I would just take it a little bit of a different dimension and say that in addition to policy, right, like I'm a conflict person. I know I come across as negative as hell, but that's because I deal with war all day, every day. We have to also think culturally, right? A lot of what we're discussing in policy has to then be established as norms. If we don't make them norms, if we don't say that this is who we are as a culture, we can't expect this thing to change, right? So, the real challenge for us is that you need to put people in office who are going to do the policy work, but then you also have to appreciate that the way policies stick is if you create a normative environment around them that supports those policies. And that's really hard to do in a polarized environment, but that's the work, right? Is you can't just get the policy and expect that the policy alone is going to fix things. You've got to build a culture around this that says cooperation is a good value. Cradle-to-cradle thinking on product production is essential, right? In the business community, I can talk about the thing I'm cynical of, but the business community is leading the way on a lot of these issues in a way that our policymakers aren't. The business community is thinking about what it means to make products that have no net impact on the environment. And that thinking is critical, right? So if that's stuff we want to do, we've got to embrace it as a culture and lift up the projects that are talking about how we make things that can be reused endlessly and how we minimize our energy uses. But that's also a cultural problem, not just a policy problem.
We have to end this at 12:10. It is now 12:07, and I would like to ask one final question of each of the panelists, and the question is, are you optimistic that we will be able to rein in climate change?
Do you want honest answers?
Yes. Well, no, you can give 2 answers, an honest one and a dishonest one.
I would say I'm stupidly optimistic because I see exceptional students in this university every single day who care about this issue and are working on it. So we may have screwed things up, and I apologize to them, Omar. I'm sorry. But they are doing incredible things that should make us all optimistic that the fix may not be great, but they're thinking about it.
My honest answer is that I think that it is a problem that has outpaced us already. So I'm not optimistic that we can halt climate change. I know that we've got the innovations that would make us capable of managing it and hopefully slowing it down. But while I'm pessimistic about the topic, and I'm just going to admit that, we don't really have an option. Pessimism and throwing in the towel isn't an option. I guess it is if you're like, I'm only going to live until it gets to like 3 degrees Celsius above, so it's fine. You guys just deal with your blazing summer vacations in the Arctic. But I just don't think that I don't think that that's something that we can turn away from, and so we just have to keep trying, and optimism helps us do that. So I'm going to choose to keep trying.
You have 1 minute.
I think we have no other option than to be optimistic, because that is what keeps us going. It's also important in the communication that you don't just talk about despair and doom, but that you talk about options. But since this is also about security, we shouldn't be naive and think that this thing will solve itself, will go away by itself. The link between climate change and climate change is there, and it is going to get worse. I hope we solve it, but you only have seen the beginning now. In the past few years, it's going to get a lot worse. It will impact security, and that means that we have to be, there's always limited amounts of money available, but it means that you also have to be very serious about how the security is going to impact you. So although you heard me talking about how we should do this all together in the world and how we should cooperate and everything, and I really stand for everything I said, be aware that there are going to be increasing security risks, and each country has to prepare for that as well. So it's a very double answer, but I fear that is the situation we're in.
I would like to thank all 3 panelists. This has been very informative, and thank you. And welcome back to CWA.